Okay. Glycolysis. So we're going to talk about this immediate energy that's available in the phosphagen system. You've got stored ATP. You've got creatine phosphate that you have stored up in your muscles, and through a one-step reaction, you can resynthesize ATP from that. And then if you get really, really desperate, you can turn 2 ADP molecules into an AMP and an ATP, myokinase reaction. Right? So while all of that is going on, this reaction is also pretty much constantly going on. Maybe we can call it in the background, but it's just going on simultaneously. Okay? And so this is going to be, this set of reactions is going to kind of happen, and it's going to reach a point at the end, or very near the end, where there's going to be divergent fates for what happens at the end, or near the end of glycolysis. And that divergent fate, okay, is one of the primary causes of fatigue, and one of the primary reasons why people have to slow down during exercise or stop exercising. Okay, kind of why it's going to go one way versus the other, or the balance of those two kinds of things. All right, so this is one of the really kind of the pathway is pretty straightforward, but kind of what happens at the end is one of the more conceptually difficult things to try to process, because it's just, why is some of it going over here? Why is some of it going with Callie and Megan? Why is some of it going over here? Right? Like, why is it doing these kinds of things? And what's controlling that kind of stuff? Okay? All right, so glycolysis is a series of reactions, okay, whereby the oxidation or the breakdown, the chemical breakdown of glucose or some other carbohydrate molecule, okay, is going to go from glucose to lactic acid. It may sometimes be called lactate. It couldn't make the least bit of difference. If you get lactic acid, you're going to have lactate. If you've got lactate, you can make lactic acid, okay? And we couple that with the synthesis of some ATP from ADP, okay? What we have gotten so far, right, from the creatine phosphate reaction and what we're going to get here from glycolysis, we get from the myokinase reaction is something that is called substrate phosphorylation. It's called substrate phosphorylation. We're transferring a phosphate from one place to another, okay, off of one molecule onto another one, okay? This is going to be very, very different than what happens at the end of the aerobic metabolic pathways, where we're going to get what we call oxidated phosphorylation, okay? So this is substrate. So what I mean by all of this is that as you move through the steps of glycolysis, we are going to directly make some ATP, all right? And it's more ATP than what we get from the creatine phosphate reaction, okay? It's more than what we would get from myokinase. It's not a lot, but it's more, right? So we need to keep that around. Other important things to understand. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. So this is happening to molecules of glucose that are located in the cytoplasm of your muscle cell, okay? We will talk a little bit about how does that glucose get there? Where does it come from? That's important. That's going to change our energy yield, okay? So depending upon what happens, we take a molecule of glucose, we move through glycolysis, we go all the way right down to lactic acid. If that glucose has entered into the muscle cell from the bloodstream, so this was glucose that came from something that you ate, or it's most likely during exercise going to be glucose that has come from the breakdown of glycogen in your liver, okay? Glucose gets brought in, and if it immediately hops into glycolysis, and it goes all the way down, we're going to make 2 molecules of ATP, okay? And I'll show you guys where that comes from. You'll understand why it's 2. If, on the other hand, the glucose molecule is coming from the breakdown of glycogen within the muscle, so it's already in the muscle, you just have to break it down from muscle glycogen, we're going to, in many ways, we're going to skip the first step, okay? And so we have to put less energy in. We're going to skip the first step because it's already there, and we're going to get 3 ATP on this,
as you will see when we run glycolysis, the entire pathway costs us a little bit of energy, but then we make more energy than it costs us, so we actually we have a net gain of ATP, but you've got to have some present in order to kind of run it in the first place, okay? So kind of the differences of where this is going to go on is going to control whether we're getting 2 or we're getting 3. Now what I can tell you guys is that, much like everything else, right now, at rest, much of the glucose that you're using in glycolysis is probably coming from either the breakdown of liver glycogen. It's coming from stuff that's in the bloodstream. How it got in the bloodstream is either you ate it or it got broken down from liver glycogen. Don't use a lot of muscle glycogen at rest, okay? Because there's not much signal to break it down, okay? So at rest, it's mostly going to be here. During exercise, it's going to be some mix of these two kinds of things. All right. Other things to appreciate. Glycolysis, even though it yields more energy, okay, it's a slower reaction than the creatine phosphate reactions. That's because it has multiple steps, okay? We can count them up. There's, I don't know, there's like 9 or 10 or 11 of them, some shit like that. More steps, okay? And so each step tends to have an enzyme that controls it, and so it just takes us longer to physically move through all of these different steps, do all the conformational changes. So if we want to make, or we need to make energy through these pathways, we're going to get more, but it's going to take us a little bit longer, okay? So that balance between how much energy do I need right now, immediately to undergo whatever task I'm doing, and can it be met by this? You know, this can contribute, but it may not be fast enough if energy demand is really good. Okay? However, it is a faster pathway than the kind of aerobic or the oxidative pathways. Because to get things, or to get, at least to get carbohydrates into the aerobic pathway, it has to undergo all of this except for the very, very last step. It comes all the way down to the very last step, and then it gets shunted over to the aerobic pathways rapidly to become lactic acid. Okay? The problem with glycolysis, much like with creatine phosphate, is that energy production is limited because the end product of the entire pathway, okay, the making of lactic acid at the end of all of this is going to decrease the pH inside the muscle, and that decrease in pH is going to function to circle back around and inhibit how this pathway works, okay? It also inhibits a bunch of other things in the like kind of mechanics of the muscle, the myosin ATPase, calcium, it inhibits a bunch of things, but it also sort of this almost like hormonal end product inhibition that eventually pH falls enough, it shuts off glycolysis, okay? Or it slows it down even more, okay? So you cannot rely solely on this particular pathway if you need a significant amount of energy, right? And now here at rest, you guys are running some glycolysis. It's not a problem. You're making a little bit from here, but your energy demand is low enough that you can meet it through some glycolysis and mostly other pathways, and you're fine, okay? But during higher intensity exercise, lots of things get changed. Glycolysis really gets ramped up, and if stuff starts getting shunted way over to lactic acid, then we are at some point inexorably it's going to shut everything down. That's going to vary from person to person. It's going to vary based upon your state of training. It's going to vary based upon, to some extent, your tolerance of discomfort. But some of it is just, you know, it's just this kind of hard and fast rule. Okay? All right. So I apologize. This is a thing that I scanned from, I think it's a cellular physiology book that I used when I was an undergrad, so it's probably a little bit old, but it lays everything out. So what you see here is called the Embden-Meyerhof pathway, okay? I don't care if you know what this is, but what it illustrates is, here is glucose, okay? Glucose has entered from the bloodstream into a muscle cell, and it's going to show us the steps by which we take glucose, and we're going to metabolize it all the way down into a molecule or 2 molecules of what's called pyruvate, okay? This is the Embden-Meyerhof pathway. We're going to get to pyruvate, And then pyruvate's going to go one of two directions, and that determines if this is actually glycolysis in the purest sense, or if it is the lead-in to aerobic metabolism. Okay. All right. So we're going to have glucose. Glucose is coming and entered into the cell. Anybody have biochemistry? You guys? Did y'all have to memorize all of these stupid structures in here? I think that's just like the torture that happens when you take biochemistry. You have to memorize all the molecular structures of all the compounds in all the metabolic pathways. I still to this day like wake up in cold sweats about this. Okay? So you will not have to do that for me. I vow we will not do that ever again. But you've got glucose. Glucose enters. You will note out here at each little step, it has an enzyme. It's going to be labeled. Okay. You guys only have to know a couple of these enzymes. I do want you to know this enzyme here that's part of the first step. It's called hexokinase. Okay. Kinase enzymes attach phosphates to things, right? That's what a kinase does. It hooks a phosphate on. So what we are doing, glucose enters the cell. It interacts with hexokinase. It then takes a phosphate off of ATP and sticks it onto the glucose. So we use some energy to tag glucose with a phosphate molecule. It makes something called glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? So you can see here, we've cost ourselves one molecule of ATP in our first step. Doing this traps, okay, the glucose in the muscle cell. It can't get away now, okay? We've locked the door, we've thrown away the key. If you don't put a phosphate on there, the glucose can diffuse right back out. Having the phosphate prevents it from getting away. So that's why we do this, okay? If I have glucose that is coming and being broken down out of muscle glycogen, we don't have to do this because it comes out of muscle glycogen as glucose 6-phosphate. It comes out that way, so we don't have to do it. So we skip this particular step if you've got coming from muscle glycogen, so I don't cost myself an additional ATP. And that's why you get 3 molecules of ATP at the end from muscle glycogen and just 2 from blood glucose. You've got glucose 6-phosphate. We're going to flip that and turn it into fructose 6-phosphate. We're then going to put another phosphate group on there to make something called fructose 1,6-bi or bisphosphate. Here, you guys remember glucose and fructose have 6 carbons in them. Okay? Carbons are important. They have 6 carbons. We're going to get to this particular step and we're going to split it down the middle. So we're going to have 2 3-carbon molecules then, right? Which is, we have this glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is going to be here. And then we're going to kind of work our way down from all of this. So we've got 2 separate molecules that are making their way all the way down. So at the end, we're going to have 2 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate. Let me point out a couple of other things here. Okay? As we go from glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, which is a mouthful if there ever was one of the things that we do, and this will be common as we get into the aerobic pathway and the Krebs cycle, is we are going to steal electrons as we change the molecular composition of our compounds here. We're going to steal electrons from it. Okay? So we're going to oxidize this, steal some electrons, and we're going to put those electrons onto this thing that's called NAD. That has a very just nicotinamide adenine dihydrophosphate, I don't know, some shit like that. Okay, it's NAD. It's an electron carrier. It has a very high positive charge, and we're going to grab the electrons and stick them on there. The electrons come on, right, and then so that's going to also pick up some hydrogen molecules. They're going to do that. So we're going to take NAD and we're going to add electrons. That's reducing it to NADH. So we're going to make, for each molecule, each 3-carbon molecule, we're going to do this one time. So we're going to have 2 NADH molecules that we've made. Okay? Then we're going to move down and we're going to now start pulling the ATP that we hooked on here off. Okay? We're going to pull it off. We're going to make 2 ATP at this step. We're going to get down here. We're going to pull off 2 more phosphates that we're going to have there. So we will have made 4. Okay? We will have made 4 molecules of ATP. We put in 1 there and 1 there, so we have 2 in, 4 out, we net 2. Okay, if we skip the first step, we've got 1 in, 4 out, we net 3, plus, we cannot forget these things, plus we have some electrons that we're carrying around here, okay? Because this is also really, really important. Either this is going to go in one of 2 directions, plus 1, okay? So we've moved ourselves to pyruvate. Questions? Are we okay with this? I'm going to make what may seem like a very innocuous statement, but people will fight you about it. Okay? I will ask this in this way. Alex, do you see in this pathway, has oxygen been used anywhere? No. Okay? I can tell you if the pyruvate goes on to go to lactic acid driven by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase, I assure you there's no oxygen used at that particular step. Okay? Glycolysis is an anaerobic reaction. Okay? It's an anaerobic reaction. You will read undergraduate, sometimes graduate level exercise physiology textbooks, and then we'll talk about aerobic glycolysis and anaerobic glycolysis, and it's just plain incorrect. It's just wrong. What they're talking about is the fate of where the pyruvate goes. And so they talk about, is the pyruvate going to the aerobic pathways, or is it staying and going to lactic acid, right? But all of these steps, in other words, glycolysis is anaerobic. There's no such thing as aerobic or anaerobic. It's all the same reaction down to there, okay? I'm pretty sure that Dr. Mike teaches it as aerobic and anaerobic so that you can try to make a distinction about the fate of pyruvate, because I'm pretty sure the book that he uses talks about it in that particular way. He knows what that is in the meaning, but we sometimes get a little bit persnickety about what all's happening down there, okay? I may ask you on the test, is glycolysis anaerobic or aerobic? Right? Or is aerobic glycolysis a thing? The answer is no, it's not. It's not a thing. Okay? But that's one of the things that makes this, you have to think like 4-dimensionally about all of this. And this is one of the things that makes it difficult. It's not a separate reaction. You're just going to get to here, and then based upon what happens here, some of it's going to go one way, some of it's going to go the other way. That's always happening. But in certain situations, more is going to go one way, and more is going to go the other way. Okay? All right. That makes sense. Right? Pearson's probably thinking, what the hell is wrong with these damn exercise physiologists that they can't, you know, it's a simple thing. Why can't you? Other things in like ISE that like these are these big like dilemmas that people argue about and fuss at each other about over things, because we're very big about that.
Not as much as from what you're saying.
Okay. You know, math is math sometimes, right? Like,
Yeah.
the building stands or it falls, or, you know, the program works or it doesn't. So it'll be nice. Okay. So you guys will even know I put it here in this way. Okay. Because I put it here in this way because we've had in previous years we've had lots of students coming from our own programs, and this is how sort of it is sort of taught. Okay. So, and I'm going to say pyruvate can be used in either aerobic or the anaerobic systems. What we mean by all of this, okay, very, very simply, is that pyruvate has 2 things. We get to pyruvate, and it can go and be turned into lactate or lactic acid. That's driven by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. Okay? The importance of this is if pyruvate goes to lactate, is that we're going to take the electrons that we grabbed from here, and we're going to give them back. Okay? And by giving them back, that turns NADH back into NAD. If I don't have any NAD to grab electrons right here, this entire pathway shuts down. Okay? And so one of the reasons that even though we make metabolic byproducts and we don't make that much energy, one of the reasons that it is useful to turn pyruvate into lactate or lactic acid is that we need to be able to recycle NADH to NAD so that this entire pathway can continue to go. Okay? Because the pathway has to go even if we want to get the pyruvate into the Krebs cycle. And it over into aerobic metabolism, where we're not just going to make 2 ATP, we're going to make 30, okay, or 34 and a half, or whatever the books say now. You can't make half of ATP. Like one time you make 30, the next time you make 29, the next time you make 31. It's a little inexact. You say, oh, you make a half. Like, you don't actually make half. Okay? So I've couched it this way here in an effort to hopefully the pyruvate stays right in sort of glycolysis as we think about it as an anaerobic pathway that gets made to lactate, or the pyruvate can then move into the aerobic or the oxidative pathways through an intermediary step. It's called the acetyl coenzyme A, this intermediate step, and then it gets into the mitochondria and it gets dumped into the Krebs cycle. We do some other things to it. Okay? So this just talks about the fate of NADH, right? That we're making some, but this is the important part of LDH. Okay? So we're going to do these kinds of things. We're going to either convert it back, we're going to give the electrons back, or we're going to shuttle those electrons and some hydrogen into the mitochondria. So you can do one of two things. Okay? When to have LDH run and turn pyruvate or pyruvic acid into lactic acid, we can donate there. Whatever's not getting donated in there is going to get donated into the mitochondria, so we can use those electrons in the electron transfer. Okay? And there's a specific transport system that shuttles these hydrogens. It's located in the mitochondrial membrane. We don't really need to look at it or talk about too much of anything.
Wait, on the reaction, does the hydrogen ions, do they get added to pyruvate, and that's why it forms acid? Or?
So, let's go back up. This is a great question. All of these things that you see here, where it says it's pyruvate, it's really pyruvic acid. These things are all being made as phosphoglyceraldic acid. These things are being made as the acids, but because they're in the cytoplasm, the hydrogen just, it just dissociates anyway. So we use them. When I was taught things, back in the dark ages, we always talked about pyruvic acid or lactic acid whenever we talked about pyruvate. And it seems in the more kind of modern version of things, we talk about pyruvate rather than. I haven't looked at a new biochemistry book though, so I don't know how they're talking about it. If we look at it from a purely in the pure kind of biochemistry book. But they're just interchangeable. Okay? That's a good question. All right, so now we're going to talk about this other parameter, okay, which is really, really important, at least from an exercise intensity standpoint and from an exercise performance standpoint. It's called lactate threshold. So I asked you guys about this on the quiz. Lactate threshold is an exercise intensity, which means it's a metabolic rate. It's a rate of using ATP at which we are going to be able to see lactate appear in the blood. Okay. Now that's also probably a slightly kind of underwhelming and imprecise definition of lactate threshold. What it probably would be better to call it is the onset of blood lactate increasing above your resting levels. Because as I told you guys, you're all running glycolysis to some extent now. You're all making some lactic acid. If you prick your finger, right, we can measure it. You're going to have maybe 1 or 2 millimoles of lactate in your blood right now. Okay? At some point, probably not walking for some of you, although, you never know, right? Walking, jogging briskly, jogging very vigorously. At some point, the energy demand in your muscles is going to increase enough that we're going to begin to see a rise over resting levels in lactate in your blood. That is termed the lactate threshold. Okay? If you take exercise physiology lab with Dr. Deb, you will, measure this. Okay? There's some very precise ways to measure this. So lactate threshold is an exercise intensity. It's the intensity at which, or the work rate at which lactate begins to increase above rest. Okay? So it is sort of the balance. It's going to indicate that production of lactate, okay, or has increased or the removal of lactate has decreased such that the net amount of lactate in our blood is rising. We're always making some, as you guys will see. We're going to shuttle some around. We grab the lactate, we throw it in the Krebs cycle, we break it down. Lactate's perfectly good fuel for lots of things. So it's not in and of itself inherently bad. Okay? So as you increase exercise and it goes up, you will first begin to increase production, but there will be a concomitant increase in removal, which is why I can start jogging. My blood lactate doesn't change. I'm making more, but I'm also removing more, so the net, it stays in balance, okay? But at some point, we are basically going to kind of, that's going to get, those two things are going to become uncoupled. We're going to kind of reach or peak out on our removal ability, and we're going to keep making more and more, so the blood levels are going to begin to rise. Okay? And we could spend, if we really wanted to, I mean, we could spend 3 days talking about all of the individual kind of mechanisms surrounding why removal changes and production changes and all of those kind of intricate steps and all of that. And I think it's enough for you guys just to appreciate what's happening. Okay? Lactic acid gets in the blood, gets in your cytoplasm, and it splits or it dissociates into lactate and hydrogen ions. Okay? The hydrogen ions are the thing that denote the drop in pH. So as your blood or your cytoplasm becomes more acidic, that will predict the onset of fatigue. The hydrogen ions mess everything up. They mess up glycolysis, okay? They mess up the rate-limiting step in glycolysis is controlled by an enzyme called phosphofructokinase. Hydrogen ions inhibit phosphofructokinase. It slows them down, okay? So you can back things up there. As I said, it inhibits the myosine capase, it inhibits granidine receptor, okay? It messes everything up, right? Because the body is worried. If pH falls too much, bad things will happen. So it's like, we don't like this, stop doing this. Stop exercising at this rate. Slow your ass down or stop, okay? So one of the best, as we'll talk about today, one of the best indicators of endurance exercise capacity, okay, is the running speed or the cycling power output at or just below your lactate threshold. There's something that's better, but this is also a really, really good predictor. Whichever one of you can run at the fastest speed before you start adding lactate into your bloodstream is probably the person that's in the best sort of aerobic metabolic shape. You're probably going to have that. Maybe not have the highest VO2 max, but you're probably going to be one of the better endurance kind of athletes. Okay? Normally, lactate threshold occurs somewhere between maybe 40 or 45 and maybe 70% of your maximal exercise capacity. I have seen, we have tested people in the lab where it was in like the low 90s, right? They can basically run at VO2 max without increasing lactate, okay? The girl, my very first job, the girl that was our best cross-country runner, had the lowest VO2 max on the team, but her lactate threshold was like 93% of her max. Like she had maxed, she was as good as she was ever going to be, right? She was just not genetically blessed. You know, her VO2 was like in the high 40s. We had the rest of the team, all the girls were in like the mid to high 50s, and she kicked their asses, right? But she had maxed out what she could do. The rest of them needed to be trained better to increase their lactate thresholds so they could eventually be able to kind of beat her. And I'll show you guys, we did a study with them where we looked at, and we actually correlated lactate threshold and some things to their actual performance times in some of their meets and things. And I'll show you all some data that we have, and data like that from some other labs and some more elite athletes kind of at the end of class. Okay, not today, but at the end of the class. There is this idea of the lactate shuttle, which we talked about on Tuesday a little bit with Keldon, but the lactate shuttle is that you make the lactate in one muscle, okay, and it may get shuttled in one muscle, and it will get shuttled around. It will, if all of you guys are individual muscle fibers, Keldon may take his lactate and hand it to Callie, and hand some to Alex, and then put some out here into the bloodstream, and it will flow all the way over here to me. And we shuttle it from one place to the next because we're trying to remove it. We don't want it to be in the blood. You can make lactate in your quads, put it into the blood and it may get taken up into your bicep or something, okay? So we want to try to remove it, and shuttling is one of the ways that we can do that. So this is a graph that will look a lot like what you guys will make in Dr. Deb's class. And this is showing blood lactate measured from a little finger stick. You stick your finger, you put a little drop of blood on a little strip. You stick it in the machine, and it tells us how much lactate is in there, right? At some point, you won't be able to do this, or they can sort of do this for coronavirus testing, right? We're just looking for the antigens for these kinds of things. But here's power output on a bike, so you're at like 100 watts, and then 200 watts, and then 3 and 4 and 500 watts. So the person just rides the bike, and we keep ramping up kind of the resistance on them. And you will note that here in kind of the first half of what they're doing, that basically blood lactate is pretty much stable, kind of give or take, right? It's pretty stable, and then right about here, you will note that it begins to increase. It's going to kind of go up in a not quite linear, but also not really kind of powerfully exponential kind of increase that's going to be right there. And so we call the exercise the power output, or you could find your VO2 value at this particular power output. This, you figure out where it goes up, and then you go back to the last measurement before that. You can do some mathematical, you can curve fit this and do some mathematical equations to figure out if it's here rather than right there, depending on how often you measure. But you do this. So this is lactate threshold, okay? I think it's important to point out, because I was taught incorrectly, okay? I didn't realize this until like 2014, which shows you some weird things, okay? I was taught by our department chair at Georgia, which is a very good program in things, by a very famous metabolic exercise physiologist, that essentially once you got over lactate threshold, you were going to fatigue, period, end of questions. That is in fact not the case, okay? So this, where this occurs relative to kind of your max is going to be a predictor of performance, but you can exercise over lactate threshold, right? And it may increase to 2 or 3 or 4 millimoles somewhere in here. And like if I go out here and we go to 300 watts, you kind of increase from about 1 up to, we'll call that 2.5. And I keep you right at 300, you may stay right there and stay right at 2.5, okay? We would call that, right, the lactate is going to stay at steady state, okay? There is an exercise intensity at which, if we get above that intensity, even though you keep like power output constant, so let's say I'm at 400 watts, okay? I stay at 400 watts, but initially my lactate is at like 6.5. I stay at 400 watts for another minute, and now it's gone up again. It's gone up to 7, it's gone up to 8. Stay there, okay? So that kind of, there is a work rate below which your lactate has increased above threshold, but you're able to reach a lactate steady state. And there's a work rate that's called critical power, critical velocity, and above that, even if you hold the thing steady, you hold your work rate steady, VO2 and lactate are going to all kind of creep up until you have to stop exercising. It's actually that intensity that's the single best predictor of exercise performance. But we'll talk about that in the class. But I was taught, oh, you get over lactate threshold and you're just, this is just going to happen and you're going to fatigue, right? Having any extra hydrogen from all of this is bad. And while it may feel unpleasant as it begins to kind of mount here, if you can tolerate that unpleasantness, then you can keep going. Okay? Anybody watch the Tour de France? I know cyclist peoples. Okay, never mind. My dad calls me every day during the Tour de France, and he asks me questions, right? Okay, they've got this, they're wearing their thing, they're monitoring their heart rates. The guys in the cars that are chasing them know their heart rates, right? Are they giving them feedback? And I'm like, yes, Dad, they're giving them feedback. But if the guy has his freaking watch, like, he can see his heart rate. He knows where he needs to be. They have little power meters on their bike, which Dr. Larson thinks is cheating. She doesn't like them. Little power meters on their bike, so they know what their power output is. They know from previous testing, like in the lab before the tour, they know exactly what the power output is at which their lactate threshold occurs, exactly the power output at which their kind of maximal lactate steady state occurs, and where their critical power is. If I get above this, if I go for very long, I'm going to fatigue. They know exactly where those things are, and so they can get that feedback, and then they can go at exactly the right pace to stay right at that level, assuming they can physically kind of willingly do all of that. So we've gotten very sophisticated with all of this. It's less so if you want to run, if you're going to go run a race or something, then, you can't, like, we don't have like I guess you could put your GPS on. Like, I have an app on my phone that I turn on when I go run, and it tells me what like my mile pace is, but I don't think I get like real time like pace estimates from it. I'm sure they make some that do. It's your Apple Watch, like you just turn the GPS on, and like I'm just going, and it tells me, okay, you're going at 3.5 miles an hour. We could.
There's no watches for it.
Yeah, I mean there are things that will tell you. Like I have a watch that has GPS, and I have a Fitbit that has GPS, and it would do it. The problem was just that you had to, like, if there's a tree like in a mile radius, it's not going to connect to the damn satellite. And you're going to run it for an hour, and then the battery's going to have run down. So this was like the first generation of these things. Again, my dad loves nothing more than gear, right? Like, if there's a watch or a Patagonia coat or something, like he's all about let's have some gear. So if we need something nice for our daughter, for Ella, we're just like that, right? Like she has these little Nikes that she wore today that no parent would ever buy their kids because they're white. They're white Nikes, and they have always like little kind of brightly colored little like speckles in them. And my parents bought them for her because they've now had a kid for 40 years. And so like, why would you buy a kid some white shoes? She's just going to go out on the playground and like fall down and step in mud, and they're going to be ruined. Today was her first day. Because they're about to be where her foot's going to be too big. So like, we got to let her wear them. Anyway, so my dad, he buys gear. So we had these watches and these things. It's always all this gear. He has a ridiculously expensive bike that he like rides and falls off of. Things. In their retirement, my dad has maybe greater means than he has sense on things. I'm like, just don't spend the money, just save it. Let's go on vacation or do something. Anyway, okay, we talked about lactate accumulation, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Aerobic metabolism, okay? Aerobic metabolism. So, and I apologize if anybody has to watch this on Zoom, but I'm going to shorthand what I want you guys to know from glycolysis, okay? You've got glucose, and the glucose is eventually going to get down here to pyruvate, okay? We're going to basically make 2 molecules of ATP, and we're going to make 2 molecules of NADH, okay? There's a control enzyme here and a control enzyme here, right? We've got hexokinase and we've got BFK, both of which we'll talk about later. You don't have to write this down. We've got a couple of enzymes, but this is all I want you to know, okay? You don't have to know the intermediate steps or anything else. You don't know that hexokinase is step 1 and BFK is step 3 or 4. I don't remember, okay? But I want you to know this. What happens, though, and the important thing is what is happening to pyruvate down here. What we have talked about so far is pyruvate going to lactic acid. This reaction here is driven by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. Okay? And then as it goes this direction, we're going to take our NADH, and it's going to donate its electrons and turn back into NAD that's going to come back up here. Okay? The other possible fate of pyruvate, and in many ways, just put a circle around glucose and put a circle around pyruvate. The other possible fate of pyruvate is to go over here into the aerobic metabolic pathways. Okay? We will spend a huge amount of time next Tuesday talking about the why. Why does it go this way sometimes? Why does it go this way some other times? But for now, let's just talk about the mechanics of if it does go over here, kind of what does that then look like? Okay? So this is kind of the way to think about all of this. all right? So we're dumping glucose through here, right? Some's going this way, some's going over here. The aerobic metabolic pathways, okay, can break down glucose, which has come out of the pyruvate this direction, or we can also have the capacity to put fat or protein in at different places. So we can use all three substrates, okay? We're going to break those things down into carbon dioxide and water while using oxygen and couple that to making ATP. And not just a little bit of ATP. We're going to make a shit ton of ATP, okay? And so in that way, the aerobic pathways are preferable, if you will, okay? It is better. We make more energy this way, okay? If I told you that you could do something, you could make $2, and eventually, right, you're going to get tired at the end of that, or you could do something else and make like $40 and never get tired. You could just keep doing that indefinitely. You're going to pick the other one, right? So aerobic metabolism is always running as long as you have oxygen, which for the most part you're going to unless you're dead. Okay? This is the main ATP pathway in our body. This is the primary one that we use most of the time. Even when you're doing, okay, very high intensity kinds of exercise, you're still getting a large contribution from the aerobic pathways to that total energy required. But it may just not be the predominant one at very, very, very high intensities right at the very start because it's slow. Okay? Problems. It can, or it needs, I guess, a constant supply of oxygen. It needs oxygen. If it doesn't have oxygen, the whole thing shuts down. Okay? Typically, that's not going to be a problem. We don't live in, we don't live at base camp climbing Mount Everest or anything, right? Maybe if you have coronavirus or you've got emphysema or something, then your O2 sat may dip a little bit. But for the most part, we're really good at bringing in oxygen, and that's rarely going to be a limiting factor. Okay? Under most dietary circumstances, we're going to primarily use glucose and fat as our substrates. We will use protein sometimes, like if I'm Keldon and I just eat all the whey protein, right? No, it's all the casein. I just eat all that, I might dump more in here because that's where I'm getting my calories from. It's okay, that can happen. Okay? Right, Keldon, we got pretty good evidence no matter how much protein you take, it's not going to kill your kidneys, right? I think Stu Phillips and the guys at McMaster have some pretty good evidence on all of that. I was told when I was an undergraduate, like, don't take creatine and don't take protein powder because it will kill your kidneys. Doesn't seem like that's really, I mean, plausibly it seems like it could be a thing that could be a problem, but it seems the evidence is it really doesn't. Okay, as long as we provide it with substrate, as long as we have sort of pyruvate coming from the breakdown of glucose or other carbohydrates, or we've got two carbon molecules being split off of fats, okay, and oxygen. As long as those two things are there, our capacity to generate energy aerobically is basically limitless. Okay? If I feed you and give you oxygen, this will run. Okay? So the other way to think about that, and I said it's unlimited, the other way to think about this is that we do not make things in the process of aerobic metabolism that result in fatigue, okay? We don't make hydrogen, okay? It's the primary thing. We're not depleting creatine phosphate or anything else. We're not doing something that is going to inexorably kind of mess up the rest of the process, okay? So that, again, that's why this is good. More energy, basically no chance to fatigue because of this pathway, okay? That's probably not 100% true. If I use up too much of your blood glucose and your muscle glycogen, then the pathway gets stopped because the brain becomes, in some ways, unhappy, and it will cause you to slow down. Just simply having fat and not enough glucose, you're fine at rest during exercise, that's not always going to work great. Okay? The issue with aerobic metabolism is that the rate is slower. Okay? You have to take carbohydrates basically all the way through into Meyerhoff, almost all the way through glycolysis. Then they have to get into this transition step that I'll show you. Then they have to go through like the 8 steps in the Krebs cycle. Then it has to go to the electron transport chain and get pinged down multiple cytochromes. And then finally, at the end of all this, we make some ATP. Okay? So it's multiple times more complicated than our other things. So because of that, it is significantly slower as a pathway than the creatine phosphate pathway and doing glycolysis, turning pyruvate into lactic acid. Okay? And in theory, it's limited by oxygen delivery to the muscle, but again, sea level and things, that's probably not a big issue if you've got normal kind of cardiovascular and pulmonary function. There may be a few instances that are exceptions, but generally that's not going to be the big issue. Okay? So aerobic metabolism occurs in the mitochondria, and it occurs in 3 phases. Okay? So we must take our pyruvate, and we have to move it into the mitochondria, and then I don't know what actyl-CoA is. It should be acetyl. Okay? An acetyl group has 2 carbons, so we're going to pull a carbon off of pyruvate, and we're going to make some, shocking, carbon dioxide. Okay? As we do this, we're going to hook the acetyl onto something called coenzyme A, right? Coenzyme A, this step is kind of the meeting point of carbohydrate and fat metabolism. They're both going to come in at this acetyl-CoA thing, and that leads us into the Krebs cycle, right? We're going to do things in the Krebs cycle. We're going to make some carbon dioxide, and we're going to make a little bit of energy, but the primary thing that we do in the Krebs cycle is we grab a bunch more electrons, okay? We make more NADH. We make a secondary electron transporter called FADH, right? We're going to grab a bunch of electrons, then we're going to move those things across a membrane in the mitochondria. We're going to do something at the electron transport chain where we move these electrons down something, and it creates this hydrogen gradient. And then we let the hydrogen diffuse across its gradient, and it drives an enzyme called ATP synthase, and voila, we make ATP. Okay? It's a totally seamless process. Okay? Every time I think about this, I'm like, how are we alive? How does any of this shit work, right? But magically, it does. Okay. So this is showing the Krebs cycle plus this transition step that is going to be here. So here we have a molecule of pyruvate. It's made it into the mitochondria. Okay? We are going to take our 3-carbon pyruvate, pull off 1 carbon, and it's going to bind to oxygen, and we're going to make carbon dioxide. Okay? That's why when you increase aerobic metabolism, carbon dioxide production goes up. We're going to then, as we do that, we're going to grab some electrons and make an NADH molecule. We're now left with a 2-carbon molecule that's an acetyl group. We're going to hook it onto coenzyme A. Coenzyme A is going to then allow us to hook the acetyl onto oxaloacetate, which is a 4-carbon molecule, and that makes something called citrate. So we're back to a 6-carbon molecule again. Okay. Previously, the Krebs cycle has sometimes been called the citric acid cycle. You may have heard it referred to as that in your biochemistry class. It's the exact same thing. So here we have citrate, and we're going to then take our citrate, 6 carbons, and we're going to spin our way around here, okay, through these series of steps, each of which is driven by a particular enzyme. Okay. As we move along here, we're going to take some electrons, and we're going to pull off some carbons. So by the time we get down here, we're at succinyl-CoA. Succinyl or succinate's a 4-carbon molecule. So we've pulled off 2 carbons, we've lost them as CoA. We pull off some more electrons, and we eventually end up with our 4-carbon molecule back up here at oxaloacetate, and the whole thing starts over again. Okay. Right. Keldon, do you remember that we talked about this? What the rate-limiting enzyme in the Krebs cycle is?
It's the isoscitrate dehydrogenase, right?
Is it? I thought it was alpha-ketoglutarate. Maybe it is isocitrate. It's one of these 2. And the reason that we know this, and I bring this up, this is kind of silly, is 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, our undergraduate quiz bowl team was winning the American College of Sports Medicine. We were winning the whole bloody thing at the national meeting, the quiz thing. They were beating every other school in the nation. And Final Jeopardy was, what's the rate limiting enzyme in the Krebs cycle? And Dr. Mike doesn't teach it to them. And so none of them knew. I didn't know. I'm like, I don't know what the hell the answer to this question is. I didn't know what it was. We asked Dr. Mike, he didn't know. We were like, this one, we don't know. So anyway, so when Keldon and them competed last year, we're like, okay, this is the thing. We got to know this one at least. In the midst of things. So, but that question did not come up. I should probably Google what that is. Is it? Okay, so it is isocitrate. So Keldon was right. And as is always going to be the case, Dr. Black remembers correctly. So this is the rate limiting, and it doesn't matter because it doesn't limit the rate enough. In a lot of instances, the rate of the Krebs cycle is going to be fine. The thing that limits the Krebs cycle is our ability to have free electron carriers to allow things to move around. We'll talk about that. If you don't have oxygen, you back up the electron transport chain. There's no place for the NADH to dump its electrons. We don't have any of this, so it can't go back until the Krebs cycle gets messed up. When we talked about fiber typing, one of the ways that we can look at oxidative capacity and muscle fiber types, at least in the old way, was they would stain for the activity of this succinate dehydrogenase enzyme, of SDH. And the more of this you have, because this happens in a mitochondria, the more mitochondria you have, the more of this you're going to have. And so the more of this, the kind of the more aerobic or the more fatigue resistant you would assume that those particular fiber types are going to be. So type 1 fibers tend to have more mitochondria. They're going to have more of all of them. You could do it for any of the enzymes. I don't know why they picked SDH as opposed to the other ones. That would probably be a really good question. But we don't really do that anymore. We have other ways of measuring mitochondrial function. Okay, we'll stop there. That's fine. We'll pick up. We'll do the electron transport chain on. So yeah, let's have critical thinking do on